you're playing tournaments wrong, and here's why. Back in the day, we started off with HUDs, push-fold charts, simple calculators, and guesswork. And then we created solvers. But it was impossible to solve ICM for large field MTTs, so we used ChipEV simulations instead. Now recently, we've developed the technology to calculate ICM strategies for large field MTT scenarios. This begs one important question though. At what point in the tournament does ICM become significant? When should you switch? We ran an experiment to find out. First of all, what is the independent chip model? At its core, ICM just translates the value of a stack from chips to dollars. And this is important because it impacts every one of your tournament decisions. You see, it's not a one-to-one ratio. ICM essentially looks at the size of each stack in a tournament and figures out how often each stack will place first, second, third, fourth, and so on. It has no preconceived notions of player edges or strategy or positions. It's just a placement probability formula. The fundamental difference between an ICM calculation and a ChipEV calculation is that ChipEV seeks to maximize chips, whereas ICM seeks to maximize dollars. These two goals do not always align. The fundamental trade-off of ICM is that it sometimes sacrifices chips to win more money, and this is because of a concept called risk premium. Sometimes in MTTs, survival is worth more than maximizing chips, so it can be worth avoiding marginal spots to survive longer. And this formula was invented in 1987 by Mason Helmuth, originally derived from Harville, who used it for horse racing. Despite its age, it took us over 35 years to fully utilize it. The reason for this is that the original ICM calculation is recursive, and this means that as you add more and more players, it becomes more and more difficult to calculate it. So if you had a tournament with thousands of players, it was almost impossible to calculate ICM. That was until recently. We teamed up with Helmuth Melcher, developer of Holdem Resources Calculator, to run an experiment. You see, HRC has developed technology to calculate ICM with hundreds or thousands of players remaining instantaneously. So we wanted to see at what point should you switch from ChipEV solutions to ICM solutions? At what point does this significantly impact your tournament results? Well, let's find out. So here's how we're going to set up this experiment. We're going to run a 200-player MTT Freezeout. 15% of the field is paid, and you can see the payout structure on the right-hand side. In order to make this simple and fast, it's going to be a push-fold tournament where the big blind is always set to 1/7 of the average stack, and the big blind will update every time a player is eliminated. Now, remember, our goal is to figure out when switching from ChipEV to ICM is important, so we're going to simulate 6 different types of strategies all playing in the same tournament, and every player knows and adjusts to each other's strategy. Let's meet the contestants. At the top, we've got ICM 100%. This is a pure ICM strategy that uses ICM calculations from the get-go. At the very bottom, we've got CEV 95% to ICM final table. Now, what does this mean? Well, for example, the CEV 25 to ICM 75 indicates that this player type uses a ChipEV strategy until a quarter of the players in the tournament are eliminated. At that point, it will switch to an ICM strategy for the remaining 75% of the tournament. And so by testing these different strategy types, we can see how well each strategy performs and figure out when it becomes significant to switch from ChipEV to ICM. Here are the results. As you can see, the pure ICM strategy at the top did the best, winning a return on investment of 3.3%. So this means for every buy-in they entered, they gained 3.3% of that buy-in back on average. At the very bottom, we've got this ChipEV/final table strategy, who is losing 13% of their buy-in. And so the question is, at what point does switching from ICM to ChipEV become significant? And it seems to start to drop off at around somewhere between 50% of the field remaining to 37% of the field remaining. Now, this came as a surprise to me because remember, the bubble is at 15%, yet we're seeing significant changes to the ROI, even somewhere between 50 and 37. So this indicates that ICM impacts your strategy much sooner than most players previously thought. Here you can see the data in more detail. On the left, we see the strategy types, followed by the return on investment, and a 95% confidence interval. we can see a steady drop-off as the pure ICM strategy dominates the field, followed by a decreasing return on investment as it switches later and later. If you want to see more information, all of our graphs and all of these charts will be in an article detailed below. Check the description. Another way we can visualize the data is to graph the in-the-money placements by strategy. So the pure ICM strategy at the top here places in the money 16.3% of the time. And we can see a smooth progression down to the ChipEV strategy at the bottom, which is only placing in the money 10% of the time. Now keep in mind, the baseline probability with 15% of the field paid would be to place in the money at least 15% of the time. And we can see that it starts to decrease at around the 25% of the field remaining mark. At that point, players who haven't switched sooner are often going to end up placing in the money less often as compared to an ICM strategy that switches sooner. Each color along each of these rectangles represents the placement. Here we've detailed how often each placement will occur for each type of strategy. So for example, in this ICM 100 column, we can see how often they're busting and how often they're placing, for example, first, second, third, fourth, and so on. Something interesting occurs here. We'll notice just how often the ChipEV 95 strategy on the right is busting, 89% of the time as shown in the top right corner. But something else I wanted to do with this data, instead of just looking at the placement probability, was compare it to the baseline probability. So a baseline probability is just how often would some player place first if you just picked a player out of a hat. So the ChipEV strategy, for example, is busting 5.2% more often, but they're also placing first more often. And this actually makes sense. This is what we expect because a ChipEV strategy maximizes chips, and according to ICM, your probability of placing first is simply your chip portion in the tournament. So this type of player plays too risky. They aren't accounting for risk premium. As a result, they are placing less often, but when they do hit a good run, they are more likely to get first or second. However, that's not nearly enough to make up for all the EV they lose by not placing in other areas of the money. Conversely, ICM 100%, this pure ICM strategy, is busting 1.5% less often and placing in the money overall much more often. We can see that proportionally speaking, they're much more likely to place in the money bubbles. 16.3% of the time they're busting in 24 to 30, which means they're hanging on right until at least they get some payment. And this is important because placing in the money more often indicates that you're going to increase your EV. But there's always a trade-off between maximizing your stack and surviving. Lastly, we can graph each of these placement probabilities according to how much money they make. So here I've used a $100 buy-in, and here's the expected value of different placements. So for example, ICM 100%, when they bust, on average, they're busting 83.69% of the time, so they're losing $83.69. And we can see throughout this how often each player is going to win or lose and how much each placement impacts your value. Again, the ChipEV strategy is placing first or second more often, but they're busting a lot more often and placing in those middling sections less often overall as well, which overall results in them losing a lot of money. So we see this smooth progression of expected value from the pure ICM strategy to the players that switch later in the tournament. Lastly, by taking those expected value data points we've calculated earlier, we can graph the in-the-money expected value by strategy. And so here we can see how often and how much money you get from each placement. And every strategy seems to follow a very similar line, except for one. The ChipEV 95/final table strategy is way off base, placing everywhere less often, busting more often, and as a result, for their work, they are placing first and second more often, but like I said, not enough to make up for all the money they lost by overplaying their stack earlier in the tournament. Good science involves isolating variables and repeating your experiment. So that's what we're going to do here. Instead of a 200-player freezeout, we're going to simulate a 1,000-player freezeout to see how that impacts the results. Same setup as before, 6 different strategies, 7 big blind average stack. Let's see how they did. Here we can see the return on investment by strategy for the 1,000 field MTT. And again, a smooth progression from the pure ICM strategy down to the ChipEV/final table strategy. And we can see it's losing quite a bit at the bottom and marginally winning at the top. Our question originally was, at what point does switching make the most sense? And here it seems that switching earlier in the event, so 50 players remaining, is approximately when it starts to impact your results to any significant degree. We can see that the 37.5% strategy is winning quite a bit less often than the above strategies. And the quarter field strategy is winning significantly less often, half as often as the pure ICM strategy. So I think this just reinforces the idea that you need to switch to an ICM solution much sooner in order to maximize your results. Again, all of this data and all of these tables can be found in an article linked below. Check it out. So here's the 1000 field MTT, 7 big blind push fold, 15% of the field paid, and we can see the strategy, return on investment, and confidence intervals. Again, we can graph the in-the-money placements by strategy. We see the same smooth progression where the pure ICM strategy is just placing in the money more often overall, winning more money overall, and as you go down, 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 the very bottom, the ChipEV/final table strategy is losing a lot more money overall. We've graphed the expected value of different placements here. This is for a $100 buy-in. And at the very bottom, we can see the total expected value given a $100 buy-in, and we can see where that EV is coming from. And I really like these charts, despite them being kind of confusing to look at, just because it's interesting to see where your expected value comes from in a tournament. And a surprising amount of EV just comes from placing in the middle of the tournament, just making it to the money rather than trying to go big or go home. The strategy that does try to go big or go home is the ChipEV/final table strategy, who is placing, fourth, third, second, first reasonably often, but also busting a lot more often and losing a lot of money as a result of overplaying their stack. Again, we've graphed those results here. So each of these lines represents each strategy, and the height of each line represents the expected value of each payout that the strategy gains. And we can see one outlier, which is, of course, the ChipEV strategy. The rest are following a very close progression. It should be noted, however, that it's more difficult to see the difference between other lines when there's one player doing significantly worse, because they make everything else look smaller in comparison. Next up, let's try more strategies. This experiment was run to a much lower sample size, so there's more noise in the results, but instead of 6 strategies, we're going to simulate 9 different types of strategies. This one is run on a 90-player MTT Freezeout, 13 players paid. Here we can see the results, but it's better to look at these graphically. We can see a smooth progression from ICM 100% at the top and CEV Pure at the bottom. So CEV Pure never switches, even on the final table. They are still playing a pure CV strategy and losing a lot of money. 17% of their buy-in is lost. And we can see that the other strategies have actually increased their ROI. And this is just basic whale theory, right? The more bad players in the tournament exist, the higher your return on investment for the other more sound strategies. Now, this one isn't quite as smooth. For example, we see that the ICM 62.5% strategy is winning slightly more often than some of the strategies above it, but this is well within the margin of error as outlined in the table above. You need a pretty big sample for these to converge, but overall we see a very smooth progression. Players who are switching earlier in the tournament are, of course, going to win more money. For experiment 4, we're going to vary the stack depths a bit. So we'll use the same 90 field MTT Freezeout as before, 13 players paid, but this time we're going to test 3 different tournaments. One is going to have the big blind set to 1/5 the average stack, so a 5 big blind push fold event. Then we'll do a 7 big blind push fold event and a 10 big blind push fold event. And we'll compare the results for 3 different stack depths to see how that impacts the strategies. First up, here are the results for the 5 big blind push fold events, so they're much shorter here, and this will give us more variance in the results, which is reflected in the confidence intervals on this graph. And again, we see the same smooth progression with a bit more noise. The pure ICM strategy, of course, winning the most, and where it starts to really matter for this event is around the 37.5, maybe 50% left mark. That's where the drop-off starts to begin. Next up, we've got the 7 big blind push fold event. Same smooth progression, and the drop-off starts to begin somewhere between half the field remaining and 37% of the field remaining. Again, keep in mind It's about 15% of the field played. It's actually 13 players, so not quite 15%, but pretty close. You can see the same smooth progression, a little bit more noise in the ROI distribution, but same pattern overall. Lastly, we have the 10 big blind push fold event. Now, 10 big blinds is inevitably going to play much tighter as a push fold strategy compared to 5 big blinds. And therefore, there's going to be, I think, a little less noise in the results, which is shown by the fact that ICM 50 through ICM 100 are all gaining the same ROI. The drop-off begins somewhere between 50 and 37.5% of players remaining, and the ChipEV/final table strategy, of course, still losing horrendous amounts of money. Let's address a common misconception. Many players believe ICM assumes the tournament stops and is paid out after the calculation. But this is not the case. Estimating the value of stacks is not the same thing as stopping a tournament. Imagine that you're looking at a cash game instead of a tournament, and you want to figure out the expected value of some hand on the flop. Would you say that the hand stops after you've assigned an expected value to it? No, that's silly. Assigning a value to some hand or some stack does not assume that the hand or the tournament stops. I think this misconception stems from the fact that ICM doesn't account for future positions, which is where future game simulation comes into place. So ICM has no preconceived notions of what the big blind will be next round or who's in position, who's out of position. It just looks at the value of stacks. We can use future game simulation to resolve this, and the way this works is by simulating one round and then another round and then another round and so on. So for example, if under the gun is very short stacked, they're more likely to bust next round, and therefore that can impact your strategy on the previous round. Similarly, if, for example, the big blind is increasing next round, that can change your decision on the current round. But despite future game simulation, and despite all of this, ICM predicts placements accurately even when no player is aware of ICM. And this is why it's often used to make deals at final tables. But let me prove this to you. Let me prove that ICM works even when players aren't actually aware of the concept. We're going to run another experiment. 2 player groups, one with half stack and one with full stacks. And everyone is playing ChipEV strategy, so no player in this tournament is using an ICM strategy. No one knows what that means. They're just playing ChipEV, trying to get the most chips possible. The big blind is 1/7 of the average stack. Same setup as experiment 1. So here we see the results for the half stack and full stack strategies. And at the top, we can see, for example, top 2% indicates how often each of these stacks places in the top 2% of the tournament. You can see the simulated results and ICM's prediction just based on stack depth. And we can see that they are identical. In the top 15%, this is in the money, we can see some very small variation, but overall, ICM is extremely accurate in predicting how often half stacks and full stacks will place in the money overall. Bottom row shows the expected value, and we can see that ICM predicts the expected value of each stack size within 39 cents for a $100 buy-in. So extremely accurate, despite the fact that no player is even aware of the concept of ICM. It's still a good indicator of what your stack is worth. So I should point out ICM is not the only tournament equity formula. There are other versions that are pretty good. In fact, Helmuth Melcher explored a lot of these in an academic paper, which I'm going to link in the description. So here we're comparing how 3 different tournament equity formulas do against a perfect strategy. They figured out the perfect strategy using brute force and a lot of calculations, which are not feasible for really any situation outside of an academic study. So how well did the original ICM calculation, that's Harville, this first row here, do against the perfect strategy? Well, it lost about 1% of its buy-in on average, which is actually pretty good. Next up, we've got Weitzman, which is a decent formula. It's a slight twist on the original ICM idea, but it's losing 2.6, 2.7% of its buy-in. And lastly, we've got Robert's formula, which is performing about as good as the original ICM formula. It's stronger in some places, weaker in others, tends to do better against the perfect strategy, but loses heads up against ICM. So the question is, why not switch to Robert's formula? The thing is, it's not as efficient. ICM is one of the only tournament formulas we know which can be scaled to large field MTT events. But it should be noted that ICM is not perfect. It's not the only formula, and it's not 100% accurate given equal skill edge. but it is very, very darn close. If you want to explore this data more, the paper is in the description, like I said, where they did a lot of other experiments comparing different tournament equity models. Okay, so I've shown you a lot of different charts and numbers, but the real question is, how does it actually impact your strategy? Well, lucky for you, GTO Wizard has MTT preflop solutions for many tournament stages, ranging from final tables to the last 3 tables, 25, 37, and 50% of the field remaining. So let's go and explore a few of these different tournament phases and compare how your strategy changes as the tournament progresses. For this first example, let's examine how LoJack's opening strategy changes as we progress through the tournament. Every player has a 20 big blind stack, and you can see the tournament phase in the top left corner. Here we're looking at the ChipEV solutions. Here we see the same solution when 50% of the field remains, so half the players have been eliminated. Here's 37% of the field remaining, 25%, and the final table. I'll go through that one more time and pay attention to what's happening in the range. ChipEV, 50%, 37, 25, final table. Interesting, hey? It's becoming more blocker heavy, more ace-x hands, and fewer pocket pairs and suited connector type hands. So why is that? As risk premium increases, more of your EV is derived from stealing the blinds rather than post-flop play. Post-flop implied odds decrease due to tightened stack-off conditions and a higher risk premium. As a result, these drawing hands are traded out for hands that block 3-bets and block calls instead. And so, that's why we see the shape of the range change. For this next example, let's examine how big blind's defending range changes facing the LoJack open. So LoJack has opened 2 chips, folds the big blind, and here we see the strategy. Where 20 big blinds effective, starting with the ChipEV solution as shown in the top left corner. When 50% of players remain, we can see it's already much tighter. There's already a fair amount of risk premium, and a lot of these hands were very close to start with. 37% of players remain, 25%, final table. That is a drastic difference. Wow, look at that one more time. ChipEV, half the players are gone, 37% remain, 25%, final table. As you can see, it gets much, much tighter even halfway through a tournament. So ICM clearly has a significant impact early on, and you should be switching to ICM sims sooner rather than later. Lastly, let's examine how button strategy changes facing a small blind 3-bet. This time we're 50 big blinds deep, and again you can see the solution in the top left corner. So button opens 2.1 chips, small blind 3-bets, and here's how button responds. Lots of calling, some jamming, not a lot of folding. All right, how does their strategy change when 50% of the field remains? Well, it's already much, much tighter. Wow, 37%, 25%, final table. That's an enormous difference. We went from defending 2/3 of our range to 1/3 of our range. So even if you don't agree with my simple push-fold experiments that I was running earlier, if you give a solver the option for complex post-flop play, it's already going to play much tighter and much more conservatively, even halfway through a tournament. I think a lot of MTT pros have been using ChipEV simulations for the majority of stages throughout the tournament, and it's only recently that we've gained the technology to calculate simulations for early and mid-stage tournament events that account for ICM. Let's summarize. The goal of these experiments was to find out when ICM significantly impacts your results in a tournament. When should you switch from ChipEV solutions to ICM solutions? We demonstrated that players who switched to ICM sooner consistently outperformed players who switched later. We tested multiple structures and field sizes. We tested multiple stack depths. We demonstrated that ICM predicts placements even when no player is aware of the concept of ICM. And lastly, we demonstrated that solver strategies change drastically even halfway through an MTT. ICM appears to have a statistically significant impact on your results somewhere between 50 and 37% of the field remaining for a 15% payout structure. I'd hazard a guess that the sweet spot is approximately 3 times the number of players who are paid. But it might be the case that when you account for complex post-flop play, the sweet spot occurs even well before that. If you guys want to examine this experiment, go check out the article, link in the description. We've posted all of the tables and graphs there, so you can go and scrutinize this. If you want to run your own experiment, I suggest you pick up a free trial of HRC, the best ICM tool on the market. You could pick up a free trial up until January 22nd, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Helmuth, who helped me run these simulations and is also the developer of HRC. If you have any questions, post a comment down below or join our Discord. Anyway, that's my video, guys. I hope you learned something new. I hope you start using ICM. And as always, happy grinding.